You thought you could break me, Jackson. But here I am, stronger than ever. Rachel's voice echoed in the silence of the grand ballroom, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The man who had once been her world stood across the room, eyes locked on her, disbelief written all over his face. Jackson Walker, CEO of Walker Enterprises, had invited her here, not out of any shred of decency, but to humiliate her in front of his new business partners and his glamorous new girlfriend. He thought it would be a fitting revenge for the woman who had once stood by his side, who had helped him build his empire. But Rachel had other plans. The elegant ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers as Jackson's laughter rang out, knowing that the tables were set to turn. This was his moment, the moment he would finally crush her. Or so he thought. As the guests mingled, Jackson stood by the bar, exchanging pleasantries, barely noticing the way the crowd parted as Rachel entered the room. There she was, in a red dress that shimmered under the lights, her head held high. Her presence radiated a quiet power, as if she were walking into her own kingdom. She wasn't alone. At her side, two young children, twins, no older than 4, walked with their mother, holding her hand with the kind of trust only children could give. They weren't just any children. They were Jackson's children, and they were about to change everything. Jackson's eyes widened as he recognized the familiar faces of the twins. The twins that Rachel had kept secret for years, the twins he never knew existed. His stomach turned as realization hit him. Rachel had done it. She had moved on, and she had done so much better without him. The room was still, as if the world was holding its breath. His mind raced. How could she stand here, in front of all these people, with the evidence of his betrayal staring back at him? How had she turned the tables so completely? Rachel didn't give him a chance to speak. She smiled coolly, her eyes locking onto his as she stepped forward. Jackson, you thought that you could ruin me, she said, her voice steady. But I've built my life. I've built this. These 2 children, they are the proof of my strength. And they are the proof of your failure. The crowd was silent, waiting for Jackson to respond, but all he could do was stare. The woman he had betrayed, the woman he had thought he could control, was now standing in front of him, with more power and grace than he had ever seen. The twins smiled at their father, unaware of the chaos their presence had just caused. Jackson's heart sank as he looked at them. He had no idea that he had fathered these children. He had been too focused on his own empire, too focused on everything but what truly mattered. Rachel's words were like a punch to the gut. You invited me here to humiliate me, she continued. But I came to show you what true success looks like. What real strength is. The guests around them began to murmur, their attention now fully on the drama unfolding in front of them. Jackson felt the weight of the room's judgment. He had thought he could get away with it. He had thought Rachel would be a forgotten part of his past, a small mistake in the grand scheme of things. But here she was, proving him wrong in the most public way possible. Rachel stood tall, her children at her side, a woman who had once been broken by his betrayal, now the epitome of strength and independence. I've rebuilt everything you tore down, Jackson, she said, her voice firm. And now, I am the one who holds all the power. Jackson's mind raced, but no words came. His mouth went dry, and he realized too late that he had underestimated her. His ex-wife had turned the tables in a way he never saw coming. The lesson had only just begun. Jackson's eyes remained locked on Rachel, but his mind was racing. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of confusion and disbelief. How had she gotten here? How had she turned into someone so powerful, so unstoppable? The room had fallen silent, all eyes on Rachel as she stood with the twins by her side. She was not the woman he had left behind, fragile and vulnerable. No, she had transformed. She had built her life, and now she was showing him exactly what he had lost. The silence was unbearable, but Rachel remained poised, unshaken by the weight of the room's gaze. You always thought you were the one in control, didn't you? She said, her voice calm, but the words were like daggers. But you never understood me. You never understood what I was capable of. Jackson tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense. What could he possibly say to the woman who had just turned his life upside down? The woman who had not only rebuilt herself, but had done so with a strength he had never imagined. Rachel's eyes flicked toward the twins, who were now playing with their toys, completely unaware of the storm that had just erupted in the ballroom. They were his children, his flesh and blood, yet he had never known them. He had been too focused on his own empire to notice the woman who had once stood by him, the woman who had carried his children in secret. He had lost everything. And now, here they were, standing in front of him, a reminder of all the mistakes he had made. You invited me here for one reason, Rachel continued, her voice cutting through the tension. You wanted to humiliate me. But look at me now, Jackson. Look at who I've become. I've turned my pain into power. I've turned my heartbreak into success. The words hit him like a freight train. He had been the one who had invited her here, thinking it would be his moment of victory. But it was Rachel's victory. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, the whispers growing louder as they realized what was happening. Jackson had thought that he could bury the past, that he could erase the mistakes he had made with his marriage to Rachel. But the truth was right in front of him, and it was staring him in the face. Rachel had moved on. She had risen above him, and now she was standing tall, with the proof of her success beside her. The twins. His children. Jackson's face flushed as he looked at them, the reality of the situation settling in. He had never been there for them. He had never been there for Rachel. And now he was left to face the consequences of his actions. You always thought you could break me, Jackson, Rachel said, her voice steady. But here I am, stronger than ever. And these two, she said, gesturing to the twins, are the living proof of my strength. They are the future I built, not the one you tried to tear down. Jackson took a step back, his mind reeling. He had no idea what to say, how to make this right. There was no way to undo the damage he had caused. He had hurt Rachel in ways he could never take back, and now, standing in front of him were the consequences of that pain. Rachel had not only rebuilt her life, but she had done so with grace, with power, with purpose. Jackson had underestimated her. He had thought that by leaving her, by tearing their family apart, he could move on, could find happiness elsewhere. But he was wrong. So wrong. The crowd around them had started to murmur, their whispers growing louder as they sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Jackson had once been the one everyone looked to for guidance, for strength. But now, all eyes were on Rachel. She was the one in control, the one who had come out of this stronger than before. And Jackson? He was nothing but a man facing the consequences of his own choices. You wanted to humiliate me, Rachel said, her voice now a little colder. But in the end, Jackson, it's you who should be ashamed. She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked away, her twins following close behind her. Jackson stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He watched as Rachel walked out of his life for good, and in that moment, he knew he would never be the same again. Jackson stood still, his gaze locked on the empty doorway where Rachel had just walked through. The room felt suffocating now, the silence around him more deafening than any words she could have said. He had thought, for so long, that he had won, that by pushing her away, by betraying her trust, he could move on and leave her behind. But now, all he felt was the weight of his own regret. The powerful man who had once controlled everything, from his empire to his own emotions, was now standing in the ruins of his own making. He had underestimated Rachel, and now, he was paying the price. The twins, his children, were the final blow. He had never known them, had never been there for them. And now, they were Rachel's living proof that she had not only survived but thrived without him. She had built a life, a future, while he had been busy chasing success, blind to what truly mattered. His mind replayed the moments before she left, her words cutting through him like a cold knife. You always thought you could break me, Jackson. But here I am, stronger than ever. He had seen that strength in her eyes, the determination, the quiet power she now radiated. She was no longer the woman who had begged him to stay, no longer the woman who had tried to hold their family together. She had risen from the ashes of his betrayal, and in doing so, she had become someone he could never reach again. The realization hit him hard. He had lost her, not just as his wife, but as the woman who had once stood by his side, building their lives together. And now, she had walked away, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions. He had tried to invite her back into his world, thinking that by offering her humiliation, he would prove his dominance. But Rachel had flipped the script, showing him just how wrong he had been. She had come into that room, not broken, but whole, more than whole. She had come as a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up, a woman who had learned to rise after every fall. And the twins, the children he had never known, were the symbols of her strength. Jackson felt a wave of guilt wash over him, but there was nothing he could do now. He had pushed her too far, too many times. The damage was done, and Rachel, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, had moved on. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the truth. As the night wore on, Jackson found himself alone, the weight of the evening sinking in. His mind drifted back to the moments when he had first met Rachel, when they had shared dreams of building an empire together. She had always been there for him, supporting him through the darkest times. But he had failed her. He had chosen his career, his success, over the woman who had stood by him through it all. And now, he was left with nothing but the cold reality of his choices. The company he had spent his life building suddenly felt meaningless. The wealth, the power, the prestige, it all seemed insignificant now. He had lost something far more valuable than all of it. He had lost the love of a woman who had once been his world. But Rachel? She had gained everything. She had found her strength, her independence, and the family she had always dreamed of. Jackson couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing envy. He had watched her walk away from him, but in that moment, he knew she had walked into a future that was bright, a future filled with possibilities. She had taken back her power, and she was no longer the woman who would be defined by his actions. She was a woman who had defined herself. The door to the ballroom closed behind him as Jackson stood in the emptiness, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the silence. His mind replayed the events of the night, the way Rachel had held her head high, the way she had walked away without a single glance back. And in that moment, Jackson knew he would never be the same again. Jackson sat alone in his office, the late evening shadows stretching across the room. The city's skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt distant, irrelevant now. His thoughts were consumed by Rachel. Her words, her power, the way she had walked into that room with such confidence, such grace, with the twins by her side. They were his children, but he had never known them. He had spent years building his empire, but it had all been in vain. He had betrayed the one person who had truly mattered, the one person who had given everything for him. The woman he had left behind was no longer the same woman who had stood by him, supporting him through thick and thin. She had transformed, evolved into someone unrecognizable, someone he could no longer control or manipulate. Rachel had done what he had never imagined. She had built a life for herself, one that was far better than the one they had shared. She had found her strength, and now, she was a force to be reckoned with. Jackson's mind wandered to the moments when they had first met, the excitement of starting a life together. He had been so focused on his own success, so blind to the woman who had always been there for him. Rachel had put her dreams aside to help him achieve his, and in return, he had taken her for granted. Now, as he sat in the silence of his office, he understood just how much he had lost. The wealth, the power, the influence, it all seemed so meaningless now. He had sacrificed the one thing that truly mattered, and for what? A fleeting sense of achievement? The validation of his peers? Jackson's heart sank as the truth became undeniable. He had pushed Rachel away, believing that he could find happiness elsewhere, but she had proven him wrong. She had moved on, and she had done so without him. The pain of that realization gnawed at him, but there was nothing he could do to change it. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. The more he thought about Rachel, the more he realized how little he had truly known her. She had always been a quiet force, but now, it was as if she had found a power within herself that he could never touch. She was no longer the woman who needed him. She was the woman who had found her own way, who had forged her own path. And now, Jackson was left with nothing but the remnants of a life he had once taken for granted. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence, but he ignored it. The world outside his office could keep turning, but inside, he felt like everything had come to a halt. His mind replayed the events of the night, Rachel's words echoing in his mind. I've turned my pain into power. I've turned my heartbreak into success. She had rebuilt her life, and she had done it without him. It was a bitter truth to swallow, but it was the truth. He had never realized just how much she had given, just how much she had sacrificed for him. And now, he was the one left with nothing. His thoughts drifted to the twins again, to the children he had never known, to the family he had lost. He had been so focused on his own goals, so obsessed with his career, that he had failed to see what truly mattered. The legacy he had built was now meaningless without the family that should have been at its core. Jackson stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The lights flickered like stars, distant and cold. He had always believed that success was everything, that power was the ultimate goal. But now, as he looked out at the world he had worked so hard to conquer, he felt an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. He had lost Rachel, the woman who had once been his partner, his equal. And in losing her, he had lost everything. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He had betrayed the one person who had truly believed in him, and now he would have to face the consequences of that betrayal. Jackson turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. The empire he had built suddenly felt fragile, like it could crumble at any moment. He had spent so long trying to prove himself to others, but now he understood that the only person he had truly needed to prove himself to was Rachel. And she was gone. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him as the truth washed over him. He had made his choices, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. There was no going back. The damage was done, and all he could do now was live with the regret of his actions. Jackson sat back down in his chair, staring blankly at the desk in front of him. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. He had thought that he could have it all, but now he knew the one thing he had truly wanted was the one thing he could never get back. Jackson couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped in his own life, as if the world around him had suddenly become suffocating. His office, once a place of pride and power, now felt like a prison, the walls closing in with every passing second. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. The regret was a constant companion, whispering in his ear, reminding him of the mistakes he had made, the people he had hurt. The phone on his desk buzzed, but he didn't bother to answer. Nothing mattered anymore. His empire, the wealth, the accolades, none of it meant anything without the one person who had truly mattered. Rachel. He had pushed her away, and now she was gone. He had thought he could find happiness in the success he had built, in the power he had accumulated, but all of it felt hollow now. The image of Rachel's face, her calm demeanor, her quiet strength, lingered in his mind. She had stood in front of him, with the twins by her side, and had shown him just how much he had lost. And in that moment, he had realized that nothing he had achieved could fill the void she had left. The sound of his own breathing was the only thing he could hear in the silence. His mind kept returning to the twins, the children he had never known, the children who were a reminder of everything he had failed to see. He had been so consumed by his ambition, so focused on his career, that he had never even noticed the cracks in his marriage until it was too late. Rachel had tried to hold their family together, but Jackson had been too blind to see it. Now, she was gone, and with her, she had taken everything that had truly mattered. Jackson stared out the window at the city below, the lights twinkling in the distance. It looked so beautiful, so peaceful, but all he could feel was the emptiness in his chest. The city had always been a symbol of his success, a reflection of everything he had built. But now, it was just a backdrop to his failure. He had tried to control everything in his life, to shape the world around him to his will. But Rachel had taught him the hardest lesson of all. Control wasn't everything. Love, trust, family, those were the things that truly mattered. But by the time Jackson had figured it out, it was too late. He had lost it all. His phone buzzed again, but this time, Jackson picked it up, his hands trembling as he answered. "Mr. Walker, we have the quarterly report ready for your review." His assistant's voice came through the line. "I'll be there in a few minutes," Jackson replied, his voice flat, distant. He didn't care about the report. He didn't care about the numbers, the projections, the bottom line. Nothing mattered. Not anymore. Jackson ended the call and stood up, walking to the window again. He stared out at the city, the same view he had admired for so many years, but now it felt empty. He had spent so much time building his empire, thinking that success would bring him happiness, but it had only left him feeling more alone than ever. The truth was, Jackson didn't know how to fix the mess he had made. He didn't know how to win back the woman he had lost. He didn't know if it was even possible. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and for the first time in years, he felt small, insignificant, like the man he had once been was now a distant memory. He had built his empire, but he had lost his soul along the way. And now, the only thing he could do was try to live with the consequences. The reality was that Rachel had moved on. She had rebuilt her life, and she had done so without him. The twins, her success, the life she had built, it was all a testament to her strength, her resilience. Rachel had shown him that she didn't need him to be happy, that she could thrive on her own. And Jackson? He had learned the hard way that no amount of wealth or power could replace the love of the woman who had once been his everything. Jackson let out a long sigh and sank back into his chair, his mind spinning. He knew he couldn't undo the past, that he couldn't take back the mistakes he had made. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for him to change, to rebuild, to find redemption. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of his past. The empire he had built might have crumbled, but there was still time to rebuild himself, to find the man he had lost along the way. It wouldn't be easy, and it might take time, but for the first time in a long while, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was the only road he had left. Jackson had spent weeks trying to make sense of the overwhelming emptiness that seemed to swallow him whole. It was as if the air had become too thick to breathe, and every room he entered felt colder, lonelier. The echo of Rachel's words, "I've turned my pain into power. I've turned my heartbreak into success," haunted him relentlessly, following him like a shadow. He had been wrong about everything. He had thought he was the one in control, that his empire was the proof of his success, but now he saw it for what it truly was, a monument to his own arrogance. Rachel had done what he could never do. She had taken the broken pieces of her life, the shards of everything he had destroyed, and had built something strong, something beautiful. It didn't take long for Jackson to realize that the empire he had spent so many years creating couldn't heal the gaping wound inside of him. No matter how many zeros were added to his bank account, no matter how many board meetings he attended or accolades he received, there was a void that could never be filled. That void was Rachel. The thought of her, standing so confidently in front of him, with the twins by her side, made his chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't felt in years, regret. His heart ached with the realization that he had thrown away the one person who had given him everything. Jackson sat at his desk, staring at the stacks of reports and financial documents that lay before him. His mind should have been on the numbers, on the next big deal, but instead, it was consumed with thoughts of Rachel and the family he had never known. He thought about how she had walked into that room, calm, powerful, with the twins, her presence commanding attention without needing to say a word. And he thought about how he had failed to see the woman who had been standing right in front of him all along. The woman who had been everything he had needed, yet he had taken her for granted. He had been so caught up in the idea of success, of building his empire, that he had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered, love. His mind flashed back to the early days of their marriage when everything had felt like it was meant to be. Rachel had been his partner, his equal, and together, they had dreamed of a future full of promise. But somewhere along the way, Jackson had lost sight of that dream. He had let ambition cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had lost the only person who had ever truly mattered. He had thought that he could have it all, wealth, power, respect, but he had been wrong. Now, as he sat in his office, the weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had no one to blame but himself. The silence in the room felt deafening, and for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt the full weight of his mistakes. The empire he had built seemed like a facade now, a hollow shell of what it was meant to be. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself to the world, but in the end, it was Rachel's strength, her resilience, that had been the true measure of success. She had shown him that success wasn't about the number of zeros in your bank account or the titles you held. Success was about love, about building something real, something meaningful. And that was something Jackson had lost. But it wasn't too late. Jackson knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he had the power to change the future. He had to face the truth, to confront the consequences of his actions, but he couldn't let that define him. He had made mistakes, but he wasn't going to let them destroy him. He had lost Rachel, but he didn't have to lose himself. There was a long road ahead of him, and it wouldn't be easy. But Jackson was ready to walk it, to rebuild his life and learn from his past. He wouldn't be the man he once was, The man who thought he could control everything. He would be better, stronger, more aware of the things that truly mattered. As Jackson stood up from his desk, he made a decision. He would do whatever it took to find redemption. He didn't know where the road would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living in the shadows of his past. He had to start over, and this time, he would get it right. Jackson stood at the edge of his office window, his gaze fixed on the city below. The skyline that had once been a symbol of his success now felt distant, almost unreachable. The lights flickered in the night, but the glow that once filled him with pride now only deepened the emptiness inside him. He had spent years climbing the ladder, building his empire, but it had all come at a cost. The price was Rachel, the woman he had loved, the woman he had taken for granted. The weight of his actions hung over him like a dark cloud. For so long, he had believed that success was the ultimate goal, that power and wealth would fill the void inside him. But now, as he stood in the quiet of his office, he realized how wrong he had been. He had missed the one thing that truly mattered, love. Rachel had shown him what it meant to truly live. She had found her own path, rebuilt her life, and in doing so, had found the happiness and fulfillment that he had never been able to achieve. He had always thought he was the strong one, the one in control, but Rachel had proven him wrong. Her strength, her resilience, had been far greater than his. She had shown him that true power didn't come from a title or a paycheck, but from within. And now, Jackson was left to face the consequences of his choices. He had lost Rachel, but he knew that he couldn't let that define him. There was still a chance for him to rebuild, to find redemption. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and a deep, honest reflection of the man he had become. But Jackson was ready to face that challenge. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. He couldn't expect Rachel to come back, not after everything he had done, but he could work on himself, on being a better man, one worthy of the life they had once dreamed of together. The road ahead seemed uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt a flicker of hope. He had been lost in the pursuit of success, but now, he saw a different kind of success, one built on personal growth, on understanding, on healing. He couldn't erase the mistakes he had made, but he could learn from them. He could become the man he should have been all along. His thoughts turned to Rachel once more. She had moved on, and that was something he had to accept. The twins, his children, had grown up without him, without his presence in their lives. He had missed so much, and the thought of all the moments he would never get to experience with them filled him with regret. But Rachel had made it clear that she didn't need him to be successful. She didn't need him to find happiness. She had done it on her own, and now, she was living the life she deserved. Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he moved forward. He could work to become a better person, a better father, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make amends for all the hurt he had caused. The weight of his choices didn't have to crush him. It could be the driving force for the change he needed. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing. He had to take the first step, and that step was going to be hard. In front of him, Rachel had been the one constant in his life, the one person who believed in him when no one else did. And now, she was gone, living her life without him. He had lost her not because of a mistake, but because of a pattern of neglect, of taking her for granted, of believing that his career was more important than the woman who had stood by his side through everything. Jackson had once prided himself on being the man who controlled his destiny, the man who could bend the world to his will. But now, as he sat alone in his office, he realized that the one thing he had truly failed to control was his own heart. He had lost Rachel, and in doing so, he had lost everything. The realization hit him again, sharper this time. He had never been there for her when she needed him the most. He had spent so much time focusing on his career, on building an empire, that he had forgotten to nurture the one thing that truly mattered, his relationship with Rachel. And now, she was no longer a part of his life. Jackson stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sprawling city below. It was beautiful, full of promise, but it felt hollow to him now. The city had been a symbol of his success, but what was success without the people you love? He had been so focused on building an empire, so focused on power and status, that he had neglected the very thing that made life worth living, connection. Rachel had shown him that. She had built her own life, her own success, and she had done it without him. She had found her strength, her power, and she had done so without needing him to validate her. Jackson had always believed that success was the ultimate goal, that it would fill the emptiness inside him. But Rachel had proven him wrong. Success wasn't about wealth or power or status. It was about love. It was about building something real, something meaningful. And now, as he stood at the window, watching the world go by, Jackson realized that no amount of money could replace the love he had lost. It was gone. He had let it slip away. The thought of Rachel, of the family they could have had, weighed heavily on him. The twins, his children, were growing up without him. He had never known them, never been there for them. They were the proof of everything he had missed, the evidence of his failure. Jackson had always thought that he could have it all, that he could have both his career and his family. But now he saw the truth. You couldn't have it all if you weren't willing to sacrifice the things that mattered most. And Jackson had sacrificed Rachel. He had sacrificed love. The emptiness inside him seemed to stretch on forever, and for the first time in a long time, Jackson didn't know what to do next. He had made his decision to change, to rebuild, but how? Where would he even start? He couldn't bring Rachel back. He couldn't turn back time. But maybe, just maybe, he could start with himself. Maybe he could find a way to live a life that mattered, a life that wasn't defined by wealth or power, but by the people he loved. Jackson's thoughts swirled in his mind, but one thing became clear. He couldn't continue living in the shadows of his past. He had to find a way forward, even if it meant facing the reality of his mistakes. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Jackson knew that if he wanted to move on, he had to start somewhere. And so, with a heavy heart but a newfound resolve, Jackson turned away from the window and sat back down at his desk. The empire he had built would always be a part of him, but it was no longer the measure of his worth. It was time to rebuild, not just his career, but his life. Time to find redemption. Time to heal. Jackson walked through the quiet hallways of his office building, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. He had spent years building this empire, but it was all fading away now, like sand slipping through his fingers. He had everything: wealth, power, influence, but nothing that mattered. The walls, once lined with accolades and achievements, now felt empty to him. He couldn't stop thinking about Rachel and the life they could have had. He had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there, supporting him no matter what. But now, as he stood in the cold, lifeless halls of his own creation, he realized that he had lost the one person who had truly believed in him. The twins, his children, were a constant reminder of his failure. He had never known them, never been there for them, and now it was too late. Rachel had moved on, and he couldn't fault her for it. She had rebuilt her life, found her strength, and built a future that didn't include him. Jackson couldn't blame her. He had pushed her away, and now he was facing the consequences. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed a number. The call rang a few times before a voice picked up on the other end. "Mr. Walker, how can I help you?" It was his assistant, a voice he had heard countless times in the past, but today it felt distant, disconnected. "Cancel everything for the next week. I'm taking some time off," Jackson said, his voice firm but quiet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, sir. I'll handle it immediately," she replied, sensing the seriousness in his tone. Jackson ended the call and sat down in the nearest chair. He needed time to think, to reflect, to figure out where he went wrong. His mind wandered back to the day he had lost Rachel, the day he had betrayed her trust, thinking he could walk away with everything. It had all seemed so simple then, but now, the weight of his actions was crushing him. He had made so many mistakes, taken so many things for granted, but the biggest mistake was letting Rachel slip away. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel the full weight of the regret that had been building inside him. He had thought that by focusing on his career, on building his empire, he was doing the right thing. But he had neglected the most important part of his life, his relationship with Rachel. And now it was gone. There was no way to turn back time. No way to undo the damage he had caused. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Jackson stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The view had always been a symbol of his success, a reminder of everything he had accomplished. But today, it felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. He had spent years trying to climb higher, trying to reach the top, but he had ignored the things that truly mattered. Love, family, connection, the things Rachel had taught him. He wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep running from his mistakes, from the truth. He had to face it, and he had to face himself. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jackson knew it was the only road worth traveling. He had lost so much, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild. To become the man he should have been all along. The man Rachel deserved. Jackson turned away from the window, his resolve hardening. It wasn't going to be easy. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he had to start somewhere. And that somewhere, he realized, was with himself. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. He could make amends, not just with Rachel, but with the person he had become. He didn't need the empire anymore. He didn't need the power or the wealth. What he needed was to find redemption. He walked out of his office, the decision made. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew it was the only path left. He would rebuild his life, piece by piece, starting with the man he wanted to become. It was time to stop living in the shadow of his past and start building a future that was worth living. Jackson had taken the first step. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but as the days passed, he began to see glimpses of the man he could be. The weight of the past still loomed over him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was finally in control of his own future. He had walked away from the life he knew, from the comfort of his empire, and stepped into the unknown. The road ahead was unclear, but he was determined to walk it. He had made so many mistakes, hurt so many people, but he was ready to do the hard work of healing. He couldn't undo the past, but he could change the way he moved forward. The first step was admitting the truth. He had been selfish. For years, he had been driven by ambition, by the desire to prove himself to the world. But in doing so, he had neglected the people who mattered most, Rachel and their family. He had taken them for granted, assuming that they would always be there. But now, Rachel was gone, and so much of what he had worked for felt meaningless. Jackson spent his days working on himself. He sought therapy, began reading books on self-awareness and growth, and most importantly, he began to rebuild the relationships he had broken. The hardest part was facing Rachel's absence. He had always thought of her as his partner, the one person who truly understood him, but now she was living a life without him. He had no idea where she was or what she was doing, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He would give anything to be able to make things right, to be the man she deserved. But Jackson knew that wasn't possible. He couldn't undo the damage he had done. The only thing he could do was learn from it, to grow, to become someone better, not for anyone else, but for himself. Slowly but surely, Jackson started to feel the weight of his past mistakes lift. It wasn't easy. Every day was a battle, a struggle to stay on the path he had chosen. But with each small victory, he felt a little lighter. The man he had been was still a part of him, but he wasn't bound by his past anymore. He was determined to move forward, to rebuild his life, to find purpose beyond the empire he had spent so many years constructing. One day, Jackson found himself standing at the edge of Central Park, the place where he had taken Rachel on their first date. It had been years since he had been there, but the memories were still fresh. He had thought back then that they had all the time in the world, that nothing could break their bond. But life had a way of changing things, and now he stood there alone, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this moment. As he watched the people around him, couples laughing, families enjoying their day, Jackson realized that it wasn't too late for him to change. It wasn't too late to find peace, to find purpose. He had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had spent so many years chasing after success, but now he understood that true success wasn't measured by the number of deals closed or the size of his bank account. It was measured by the connections we make, the love we give, and the way we treat others. He didn't need to be a CEO to be fulfilled. He didn't need to be rich to be happy. All he needed was to be a better man. Jackson wasn't sure where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing. He was ready to take it. He was ready to rebuild, not just his career, but his heart, his relationships, his life. And even though Rachel was no longer in it, he knew that he had the power to create a life filled with meaning, purpose, and love. He didn't know if he would ever be able to repair the damage he had caused, but he was determined to try. For the first time in years, Jackson felt free. Free from the weight of his mistakes, free from the chains of his past. He had a long way to go, but he was no longer afraid. The man he had been was gone, but the man he was becoming, he could live with that. Jackson stood at the edge of a new chapter in his life, the uncertainty of his future hanging in the air like the morning fog over the city skyline. The journey he had started months ago, after his fall from grace, was one he could not have imagined for himself. Yet, here he was, standing on the precipice, ready to dive into a future that was undefined but full of possibility. He had spent countless nights reflecting on what had gone wrong, what he had lost, but now, his focus was shifting. He couldn't change the past. He had learned that the hard way. But what he could do was change who he was in the present, what kind of man he would become. That was the one thing still in his control. Jackson's mornings had become his time for reflection. The quiet hours, just before dawn, when the city had not yet fully woken, became the moments he needed to reconnect with himself. He would walk through Central Park, breathing in the crisp air, clearing his mind, and allowing himself to feel the weight of his past without letting it consume him. He realized that to move forward, he had to let go of the need to be perfect. He had always prided himself on his ability to control everything, from his company to his personal life. But it was in the letting go, in the acceptance of his imperfections, that he began to find peace. As he walked through the park, watching the world come to life around him, Jackson found himself at a crossroads. He could go back to his old ways, chasing success, building his empire, and hiding from the truth. Or he could choose a new path, one that was rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and love. He thought of Rachel often. He thought of the life they had once shared, the dreams they had built together. He thought about the family he had neglected, the children he had never truly known. But as much as he longed to turn back time, he knew he couldn't. Rachel had moved on, and in doing so, she had shown him the most important lesson of all. That life went on, no matter what. The question now was, what would he do with that knowledge? Jackson had spent years working for the approval of others, for the validation of his success. But he had never asked himself what he truly wanted. Now, he had the opportunity to answer that question. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the weight of the past would threaten to drag him back into the darkness. But Jackson was no longer afraid. The man he had been, the man who had let his pride and ambition define him, was gone. In his place was a man who was willing to be vulnerable, willing to admit his mistakes, and, most importantly, willing to change. As the weeks passed, Jackson began to rebuild his relationships, starting with his own family. He reached out to his parents, reconnected with old friends, and began to understand the importance of the connections he had neglected for so long. It wasn't always easy. Some relationships, like with his parents, took time to heal. But with each step, Jackson felt the weight lifting off his shoulders. He was no longer carrying the burden of his past alone. He was learning to share the load. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, watching the sun set over the city, Jackson received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "Jackson." The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, though it had been years since he had heard it. It was Rachel. "Rachel," he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "How have you been?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "I've been good, Jackson," she said, her voice warm but distant. "I wanted to reach out to you. I've been thinking a lot about everything." Jackson's heart sank, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, he found himself speechless. "I know I can never undo what I did," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I've changed. I'm working on myself, and I want to be better." There was another pause, and Jackson held his breath. He didn't expect Rachel to forgive him, but hearing her voice again, hearing her take a moment to listen, filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. "I'm proud of you, Jackson," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm glad to hear that you're working on yourself. But I think we both know that we can't go back to what we were. We've both changed." Jackson nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand," he said, the words heavy but necessary. "I just wanted you to know that I'll always care about you. And I'll always be here, if you ever need me." Rachel's voice softened. "Thank you, Jackson. I think we're both on different paths now, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate everything we had. Take care of yourself. You too, Jackson said, his heart aching. As the call ended, Jackson sat there, staring at his phone. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had made the call. He had reached out. And even though things would never be the same, he knew. He had done what he could. He had taken responsibility. He had changed. And that was enough. Jackson sat in his quiet apartment, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching his ears. It had been several months since the call with Rachel, and life had slowly started to settle into a new rhythm. The pain of losing her was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, he found himself focusing on the present, on what he could control. He had taken the necessary steps to rebuild himself, and though it wasn't easy, he had made significant progress. He spent his days working on his personal growth, seeking therapy, and learning to value the things that truly mattered. The loneliness was still there, but it had transformed into something more manageable, something he could live with. The calls with his parents had become more frequent, the silence between them filled with understanding and a quiet acceptance of the past. Jackson knew he had made mistakes, but he was no longer defined by them. Each day, he worked to rebuild the connections he had lost. The most important of these connections, of course, was with himself. As he walked through Central Park one evening, the air crisp with the autumn chill, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The city, which had once felt like a constant reminder of his failures, now felt like a place of opportunity. For the first time in years, he felt free. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had the strength to face it. He didn't need Rachel in his life to feel complete. He had learned that he was enough on his own. He thought back to the lessons he had learned along the way, the importance of love, of connection, of being true to oneself. He had spent so long chasing success that he had forgotten the simple joys of life. Now, he was learning to appreciate them. Jackson's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He took it out and saw a message from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey, man, I know it's been a while. Would love to catch up soon. Let me know if you're free." Jackson smiled, his heart lifting. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the simple act of connecting with others. He replied, agreeing to meet up the following week. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, a sign that he was opening himself up to the world again. Over the next few weeks, Jackson continued to grow, both personally and professionally. He found fulfillment in his work, not the kind of work that involved long hours at the office or making deals that boosted his ego, but work that allowed him to help others, work that gave him a sense of purpose. He started volunteering at local charities, using his skills and resources to make a difference in people's lives. He wasn't doing it for recognition, but because it felt right. One afternoon, while volunteering at a community center, Jackson ran into an old acquaintance. It was a woman he had once known, someone he had briefly dated years ago before everything had fallen apart. Her name was Emily, and seeing her again brought back memories of a time when life had seemed simpler. She recognized him instantly and walked over with a warm smile. "Jackson, it's been so long," she said, her eyes lighting up. "How have you been?" Jackson returned the smile, a sense of ease settling over him. "I've been doing better," he said, "taking things one step at a time." Emily nodded, her gaze softening. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "It's good to see you again." They spent the next few hours talking, reminiscing about the past, and catching up on the years they had missed. Jackson realized that while his past mistakes still haunted him, he had the power to move beyond them. He could reconnect with the people he had lost, and he could rebuild his life, one small step at a time. As he walked home that evening, Jackson felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer the man he had been, the man who had let his ambition define him. He was a new man, one who understood the importance of love, of family, of forgiveness. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jackson knew that he was on the right path. He didn't need to chase success or prove himself to anyone. He just needed to live authentically, to embrace the person he was becoming, and to appreciate the beauty of the life he was now building. As he looked up at the stars that night, Jackson knew that he was no longer lost. He had found his way back to himself. Jackson woke up early that morning, as he had done for the past few months. The familiar quiet of his apartment was comforting, and as he sat by the window with a cup of coffee, he could feel a sense of peace settling over him. It was a different kind of peace from the one he had once found in his accomplishments. This was a peace that came from within, from accepting himself and his past. The weight of his mistakes, the guilt, the regret, it was still there, but it no longer had the power to consume him. He had made peace with it, as much as he could. His thoughts drifted to Rachel, to the life they had once shared. He still missed her, still longed for the connection they had. But he understood now that life had taken them in different directions. Rachel had found her own path, one that didn't include him. He could accept that. He had to. Over the past few months, Jackson had worked hard to rebuild not just his career, but his relationships. His parents, old friends, even people from his past. He had reached out to them, apologized for the times he had let them down, and sought forgiveness where it was needed. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. He didn't want to live a life defined by isolation and regret. He wanted to live a life of meaning, of connection. Jackson knew that he would always carry the weight of his past with him, but it was no longer an anchor holding him down. It had become a part of his story, a chapter that had shaped him into who he was today. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt ready to embrace it. He wasn't chasing success anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was living for himself, for the man he was becoming. As he finished his coffee and stood up to get ready for the day, he felt a sense of purpose that had been absent for so long. He had learned the hard way that success was fleeting, that it could slip through your fingers if you weren't careful. But the relationships he was rebuilding, the sense of fulfillment he was finding in his work, those were the things that would last. That was the true measure of success. The phone buzzed on the counter, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from his old friend Emily, the one he had reconnected with a few weeks ago. "Hey Jackson, I'm free this afternoon if you want to meet up. It's been great catching up, looking forward to seeing you again soon." Jackson smiled as he read the message. He had been making progress, but it was moments like these, simple acts of reconnecting, that reminded him of how far he had come. He texted back, agreeing to meet Emily at a cafe later that day. As he drove to meet her, Jackson felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had been so focused on his career, so consumed by his need for validation, that he had forgotten the importance of these small, meaningful connections. He didn't need to be someone else anymore. He didn't need to wear the mask of success to feel worthy. He just needed to be himself. The cafe was busy when he arrived, the sound of chatter and clinking cups filling the air. He spotted Emily sitting at a corner table, a warm smile on her face as she waved him over. Jackson walked over, and as they greeted each other, he realized that the simple act of being present, of sharing a moment with someone who cared, was more fulfilling than any business deal or accolade. They spent the afternoon talking, catching up on the years they had missed, and for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt a genuine connection. It was refreshing, the ease with which they spoke, the comfort of having someone who understood him. As they parted ways later that afternoon, Emily gave him a hug, her smile as warm as when they had first met. "It's good to see you doing so well, Jackson," she said. "Keep taking care of yourself." Jackson watched her walk away, and for a brief moment, he felt a sense of hope, of possibility. He wasn't alone anymore. He had people in his life who cared about him, who supported him, and that was all he really needed. As he drove home, the sun setting behind the skyline, Jackson knew that the road ahead would continue to be difficult. There would be days when the weight of the past would feel unbearable, but he also knew that he was no longer defined by his mistakes. He was a man on a journey of growth, and he was ready to see where it would take him. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't need to be. He was learning, he was growing, and that was enough. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Jackson felt a sense of peace about it. He was ready to embrace whatever came next,